Welcome to everyone just tuning in today for our spirituality discussion. I'm so glad to be able to speak with you today through the internet, and I hope you enjoy the topic of today's conversation. We're going to be returning to Solala Towler's book, Tales from the Tao, The Wisdom of the Taoist Masters, which the book kind of cuts out because of the virtual background. It's a great book. We've used it a couple of times here. And of course, you'll remember that from our group discussions in the past when we were physically able to get together. So our story today is about an old man who is fishing on a riverbank. And it turns out he's actually a scholar, a very famous scholar of note in ancient China. And two messengers show up to try to recruit him to come back to the capital to be the wise sage for the king of that region. And so let's go ahead and jump right into this story. I think it's going to be a great narrative to try to explain the difference between choosing happiness and choosing misery, and also probably providing commentary in a way that all of us can connect to with our lives and with the world around us, and how it seems like we're constantly called into participation with that world. But this gives us a picture of what it's like if we say, sometimes instead of participating with the world and all those worries, sometimes you have to participate with who you are, and that might mean, being separate from the crowd for a while. So let's go ahead and look into this. Now I'm going to skim this story, so if I pause at any point, that's because I'm looking for the next section, because it's multiple pages and we don't have time to read them all. The old man, and this story is called Down by the River. And it's on page 23 in the book. Down by the river, the old man sat down on the muddy bank of the great river, fishing quietly and watching the water flow. He liked it there, out with the sun and the mosquitoes, his toes squishing in the mud. He didn't mind a little dampness. He just liked sitting by the river and watching the water flow. His line trailed out into the water even though he used no bait. Catching a fish was not important. The simple act of sitting by the river, his toes in the mud, and the line dancing over the water was enough for him. The old man had been a philosopher and a student of the way for quite some time, and he was not popular with certain segments of society. And thus he was on the riverbank fishing without bait. Some segments of society that he was not popular with was the pedantic logicians and the like, who used weapons as a screen to hide behind or brandished them like weapons. He knew he was laughed at oftentimes behind his back and sometimes to his face, but he didn't care. He knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know, and that was enough for him. But still, his fame had spread lately, and he was continually being bothered by people seeking ultimate truth, as if such a thing could ever be conceptualized and put into plain words. No, he was better off here by the river, alone except for the mosquitoes and an occasional bird. He loved looking at the river and thinking about the great unfolding way and his place in it. He had learned a lot just by sitting here and watching the water flow by. Suddenly, he heard a commotion behind him. Two men were sliding down the muddy bank and coming towards him. They wore royal insignia and were messengers of the local lord who lived just on the other side of the river in a great castle. Years ago, the old man had lived in the capital and had known many such people. They were mostly a very boring and irritating crowd. Their energy stuck in their feet, and they were the reason he had left the capital so long ago and retired to that village. The two messengers, who wore very expensive robes of silk, were struggling to hold up their garments to avoid them from getting muddied, and they were out of breath by the time they reached him. "Honored sir," they said, "are you the one they call?" And then they rambled off a long honorific title that he had been given years ago at the Capitol in recognition of his sagehood. At first he thought about lying and denying it, but he realized the messengers already knew who he was when they climbed down the riverbank. They were just being a formality, and he knew how to play the game. Sighing, he got up slowly and turned to them. "Yes," he answered, "I am that most unworthy person." Smiling, he knew what they were looking for. The messengers looked at each other and nodded knowingly, and thought to themselves, this must be the great sage their Lord had sent them after, even though he looked like a ragged fisherman. "We have been sent by the great Lord of this province to bid you to come to his castle, so that he may humbly beg you to share some small part of your great wisdom with his lowly household." Rubbish, the old man thought to himself. He knew exactly what would happen if he went to the castle. Hours and hours of false modesty, to be followed by days and days being a virtual prisoner in the castle, arguing with noblemen who had never had an original thought of their own, and he'd have to deal with whatever quote-unquote sages the noble had dragged there as well. He remembered dealing with those long-winded Confucians who confused propriety and wisdom, duty and Taoism, classicism and true spiritual freedom. He wanted no more to do with that. The logicians were even worse. How they loved to confuse people and conspire with endless words and torrents of sentences, words with no spirit or real energy behind them. Words which clouded one's thoughts and induced a narcotic, hypnotic effect that numbed the mind to the true reality. No, he couldn't stomach any more of that. He had to find a way of turning them around without incurring the wrath of the local political lord. Suddenly an idea came to him. "Wait," he said. "You have the shell of a ritual tortoise at the castle, do you not?" The two messengers paused and looked at each other. They didn't know quite what to say. The old man had been a little bit abrupt, and they hadn't expected it so much. After a long pause, one of them answered, "Yes, we do have a great and ancient tortoise shell, which, as you most assuredly know, O wise sir, that this great tortoise shell is used for divination at certain times of the year." The old man remembered all of the pomp and circumstance of the divination ceremony, where the ancient tortoise shell would be carried into the hall and it would be burned so that the cracks could be read by the local priest. The local lord wanted to know, what kind of year would he have? What kind of year would his kingdom have? But the priests were not fools. No matter what the tortoiseshell said, they would never share bad tidings. Instead of telling about the floods and the farmers going hungry and the diseases and the pestilence which the common people would experience, no, they would tell him about how beneficent he was, how wise he was, and what a great ruler of people he was, and how generous and compassionate he was to all of his people. The very thought made the old man want to vomit right away. And then he came back to reality when the messenger said, "Well, what do you think?" The two messengers looked at each other again, and the old man said, "If the tortoise himself had been given a choice between being slaughtered for his shell to be venerated for hundreds of years, or to be left alone to drag his tail in the mud, what do you think the tortoise would have wanted?" The two messengers looked at each other again, Confused, was this some kind of a test? They thought it was a bit odd, and then after several minutes, one of them finally spoke up. He said, "Well, I suppose if it were truly up to the tortoise, he would rather be left alone to do, as you say, drag his tail through the mud." The old man smiled and said, "And that is precisely what I intend to do with mine." And then he sat down on the muddy bank. The two messengers watched him for some time and then trudged away. What would they say to the great Lord? Would they tell him they found the wise man? No, they would just say they found some old man sitting in the mud on the riverbank. Chuang Tzu. Now, this version is from Solala Towler. I shortened it quite a bit and also changed sentences and things. So if you happen to read the book, it won't be the exact same because I don't speak quite like he does. So, but it's a great story, and really there are three takeaways that kind of pop into my mind with this story. I think certainly we can all relate to being in the experience of going through something and then you're glad it's over. You don't really want to go back to it. For instance, for him, it was, working at the Capitol. But the three takeaways that I want to get away, talk about, Solala Towler frequently uses this line. It's not only in just this story, but it's other stories as well. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know. I like this phrase a lot, and it's a short sentence, and it summarizes basically that, the fisherman did not put on airs. He knew what he knew, and he didn't brag or make up things he didn't know. And for the things he did know, he didn't brag and boast about those either. To know what you know and to know what you don't know means you don't gossip or speculate about other people. You don't, put on airs of celebrity or grandeur or think of how great you are. Even though in the story, he most assuredly is quite famous. He did work for the emperor at one point, and was well regarded as a scholar. But no, the reason he is sitting on the riverbank is because that is where he finds himself being happy. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know. He knew what he liked, and he knew what he didn't, and no amount of pomp or circumstance or celebrity or the promise of wealth or power would get him to change that. Secondarily, the fisherman does not like high society. He gave up trying to win those arguments among the aristocracy long ago. And at one point in the story, he says, "What does it matter if one loses or another wins?" I didn't read that line. I skipped that paragraph. But he said, what does it really matter? If you have this long, drawn-out argument with another scholar, what really is the effect of it? He complains about the Confucians. That would be the religious or the moral leaders of the society at that time. He said they mistook propriety, basically the formality of how things work, the customs of society. They mistook formality for wisdom. People do that today too, I think. He said the priest wouldn't dare tell the local lord the truth of what the future had in store. The politicians didn't want to hear the truth, and the religious authorities had no voice to speak it to them. He doesn't like the logicians, that is to say, the empirical scholars, or what we today might call scientists. He says they are even worse than the Confucians and the politicians. He says they get hung up in their words that have no real spirit or energy behind them, and that the effect is mind-numbing. I think that's pretty interesting too. Basically, you can't see the forest for the trees, is what he's trying to say, that it's possible for people to get so hung up in academia. And, possibly you may have met some, but they get so hung up in academia that they forget that there is an actual world to be experienced and not just documented. Politicians, that was the third category of people he did not like, which I was surprised to say he put the scientists or the logicians. he put them actually in front of the politicians on his dislike scale. I thought that was interesting. But the politicians, he complained, didn't want to know the bad news of their kingdom. They didn't want to hear about floods or hunger or pestilence. All they wanted to hear about is how benevolent and beneficent they are, how wise they were, and how compassionate they were to their people. And I think that's probably true for most of human existence, that we've had politicians like that. The third thing I want to share with you, and probably the main takeaway, is the choice between happiness and misery that he's presented with. So he left the capital, he put all that behind, he retired. He is enjoying the peace and serenity of the contemplative life, as it were. He's fishing, he's just staring out the water. Actually, he's not even fishing. That's probably not even the right word, because he's sitting there with a fishing pole so no one bothers him, but he don't have any bait. He's not trying to catch anything. The honest truth is he just enjoys being alone by the riverbank, and the fishing pole is a distraction. Even the messengers don't notice that he's not really fishing. So that's his happiness, just sitting there in nature, just enjoying the morning, as it were, the birds and the mosquitoes even, and he's just enjoying that. And then lo and behold, fame, power, wealth, prosperity, celebrity, all of these things are provided right here. So there's a dichotomy, there's a choice. And so on one hand, the celebrity, the wisdom, the bragging rights, your name in books. And on the other hand, your name not in books, but you being happy. And he compares this to the tortoise shell. So I kind of took it as this wisdom that he has. If he was to go to the castle, the tortoise dies, of course, to provide the tortoise shell for the king to burn and for the priest to read and say, oh, it's going to be a great year or a terrible year, that divination that was popular in ancient China. So basically, if he goes to the capital, they'll remove his shell. That is to say, they'll take his wisdom, they'll entome it, they'll write books about it, they'll catalog it, and the people will debate and talk about what he meant and what he said for the next 100 years. And meanwhile, they will forget about him because of his shell, because of this thing he provided to them, that will be their actual focus and not really him as the person. Joseph Campbell used to say, let me find my quote here. He used to tell people to follow your bliss, follow whatever made you feel alive, and that would lead you to where you should be. Of course, I'm ad-libbing that thought, but he did say follow your bliss. That was a big quote of his. So it's important to note that this bliss that we're talking about here, this happiness, is not an Epicurean happiness. It's not a moral relativist. You do what's good for you, I do what's good for me, and it makes us happy. No, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a happiness that will make you better, a happiness, a choice that will lead you to happiness. And so sometimes what's good for you isn't fun. That is true. I'm not taking that away. But sometimes what's bad for you is fun. So in this instance, I'm sure he would have actually enjoyed the celebrity and the fame that goes along with it and the parades and who knows what the local lord would have given him if he had won. I'm sure it would have been a lot of fun for a little while. However, that wouldn't have lasted forever. There's a Chinese phrase, good medicine tastes bad. And certainly sitting on a muddy riverbank with the mosquitoes was probably not the most enjoyable exercise. I'm sure when he got bit by the mosquitoes, it was not like a euphoric kind of a thing, like, oh, that was great, I just got bit by another mosquito. It's the 15th one today. I'm sure that's not what the story is talking about. The story is talking about what makes you feel alive. And in there, he was most true to himself and most connected to the world around him. It was not an artificial reality. The enjoyable part of the river was there, but also the unpleasant part. And I feel like the more you get involved in society, the harder it is to distinguish between what is good and then what is unpleasant but seems good. So the three takeaways, going back to that, number one, he complains about three categories of of society. He complains about the religious leaders, he complains about the scientists, and he complains about the politicians. Certainly, those are probably the three segments of society people complain about the most today. So that's takeaway number one. There are certain parts of society that are slightly dysfunctional. Sorry, those were the three categories. Those are the three categories. So the first category, the first of the three, he knew what he knew what he didn't know. So that's good. Number two, it was about the types of people in society that kind of cause problems and don't really present themselves as they should. And the third thing, the main takeaway, is this choice between happiness and freedom. So the moral takeaway to the story is, when you're looking at two choices, and whatever that might be, will this make me better? Will this lead me to happiness? That's not to say, will this thing make me happy at first? Like I said, the Chinese say good medicine tastes bad, and taking bad tasting medicine is good for you, although it is not fun or pleasant. Sometimes what's good for you isn't fun. But when you're deciding between two things, like watching the news, which might stress you out, or watching the birds, perhaps do like Chuang Tzu in the story. Perhaps choose the watching birds. If you have a book that you have been desperately trying to finish reading, and it is dull and pedantic and, very intellectual, but no matter what, you can't bring yourself to really enjoy the book, perhaps really what you're looking for is not that book. If you look out your window and you see the clouds, and when you're trying to read the book, you keep getting distracted by the beautiful clouds, perhaps really what you're being called to right there is to enjoy that moment with the clouds. Perhaps if you're trying to watch the news, but somebody keeps calling you up on the phone, maybe what you're being called to at that moment is not to worry about the news, but to just enjoy the phone call. Whatever it is, we all sort of have this choice, like Chuang Tzu had it in the story, in Solala Towler's story. Are you going to do what makes you happy, or are you going to do what other people will expect would make you happy? And those are not the same things. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope you got a lot out of it. Once again, to recap, the three takeaways: he knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know. And I think we should all be that way. Number two, don't try to argue with segments of society, whether they be politicians or scientists or religious leaders, because you're never going to win. And the proof of that is that people have been arguing with those three categories of people since the beginning of time. And the third takeaway is, when you have a choice between what makes you happy or what other people would expect to make you happy, choose what makes you happy. Anyway, I hope you have a great Thursday. I hope this is a great day for you. It looks like we have beautiful weather here. I'm just looking out the window. And so I hope you enjoy whatever it is that you are being called to at this moment on this Thursday. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.